All right, so good morning, class. What we're going to do today is create a little collage in our sketchbook of different visual examples to represent each one of the 7 elements of art that we have learned about. So line, shape, form, texture, value, space, and color. We are going to be looking for one picture from a magazine to represent each one of those elements. So in your sketchbook, you are going to write elements of art at the top and put your name and your class code. Then once you've got that written at the top, we're going to set this aside temporarily and we're going to grab some of the magazines that you have collected. So from your house and maybe from your neighbors or family members, hopefully you found a couple of interesting magazines that you can look at. I've just got some Southern Living and House Beautiful. So I'm going to walk you through the elements in order to show you what I have found. So the first one is line. Now line we know is a one-dimensional point. It's anytime you put a pencil on your paper and then you start to move it, you're creating a line. So it's a one-dimensional point. You can have thick lines, thin lines, any sort of line that you can imagine. But one of the images that I found in this magazine that I thought would be a good example of line was on this page, this little illustration with the skyline of Charleston with its big bridges in the background. This image is made up just entirely of line, and I thought it would be a perfect little illustration. So what I'm going to do is cut that image out. Okay, and so now that I've got this image, I'm going to just take this and put this off to the side, and I know that I have my line picture ready to go. So the next image I'm going to look for is shape, and I have already found one of those that I thought would work well. So we know there are geometric shapes like circles, squares, triangles, and such. And we also have organic shapes, things that are not perfectly symmetrical and things that may be more organic and smooth flowing, asymmetrical type of shapes. But I found this image in this magazine where she's got this great gold earring, and notice it is made up of a flat circle, a flat rectangle, and another flat circle. So that is a good example of shape. Shapes are totally flat, whereas forms, if you remember, are three-dimensional. Okay, so now I have my shape picture, so I'm going to set it off to the side as well and check it off of my list. The next one that I'm going to look for is form, and forms are made up of shapes and they are three-dimensional. So that means it has height, it has width, and it has depth, and that's what shapes lack. So when I think of a form, I always just think of a like a cube or something that's fully three-dimensional, a sphere, something like that. So for a form, I found a picture of this page with the coffee mugs, and I thought that would be a good example to represent form. Anything that's three-dimensional can be a form. A coffee mug, for example, a table, a chair, even a person, cars, pretty much everything you interact with in the real three-dimensional world is going to be considered a form. So I'm going to cut one of those out. And now that I've got my form cut out, I can set that off to the side and check that off of my list as well. So now with our fourth element of art, texture, there's something specific that I want you to look for with texture. We know that texture refers to the tactile quality of anything. Some things may feel smooth or silky or glossy or rough or bumpy or prickly. Any of those sort of interesting kind of tactile description words are good words to describe textures. So what I'd like for you to do when you're looking for a picture of texture is find a picture that has at least 3 different textures in it that you can describe. So I have found one of those, and I thought this picture right here would be a nice one because each of the items of clothing that she's wearing is very, very different in each of the textures. So if I look at her boots, those look like they are made out of leather. So I would describe those as smooth or slick, maybe even glossy because they're sort of shiny. And then her skirt is very slinky looking. So I'd maybe describe her skirt as sort of soft and silky. And then her sweater is a woven knit material. So I would imagine that that texture would feel more maybe soft and fuzzy as opposed to the soft and silky texture of her skirt. So those are three really good, distinct and different textures in that picture, and that's what I'm looking for. Okay, so now that I've cut this picture out, that gets me my picture for texture, so I can check that one off of my list. And then next I'm going to look for value. And now we know that value is the range from really, really light values to really, really dark values, and everything in between that sort of scale. So for value, we're going to be looking for an image that has a good range of all of those values. You want to look for a picture with light lights, medium values, and really dark darks as well. For that, I wanted to show you two different examples that could work. I found this picture. This one is just monochromatic, just a one color of violet. But notice how the picture itself fades from light to dark. It actually gives me a perfect value scale. So that is an excellent example of color creating value, and I've got that full range of light to dark. There's another example I also wanted to show you. This image here with the family picture that's in black and white. This grayscale also is a great example of value. So either one of those will work perfectly for this element of art. Okay, so now that I have my value scale, or my value image picked out, I'm going to set that off to the side and check it off of my list as well. The next image that we're going to look for is space. And space, we learned about that it can work really in two different ways. We can talk about space as in showing depth in a work of art, things that are nearer and further away. And we can also talk about space in a two-dimensional way, talking about how things are spaced out on a flat two-dimensional piece of paper or flat two-dimensional artwork. So I want to show you what both of those options would look like for this assignment. You can choose to find a picture for either or. Either one will work. So for space, as far as showing three-dimensional depth, this is a good picture that I wanted to show you. Now there are three really important vocabulary words that I want to introduce you to with the space showing depth. And those vocabulary words are going to be foreground, middle ground, and background. So if you find an image that shows space with depth, you can look, these awards sitting here would be considered in the foreground of the image. This car is a little bit further away, it's further back in space, so that would be considered in the middle ground of the picture. And then even further back behind that, we have the trees, and we also have the cityscape back there. Those things would be considered in the background of the picture. So foreground, middle ground, background, and those things work their way back as it moves deeper into space. So that's a great example for what you want to look for with space. The other way that you can look for space is to look at space two-dimensionally. So talking about space in a two-dimensional way, we can talk about space as being either positive space or negative space. Positive space means the objects and things that occupy real space. So in this picture, this cute little dog would be considered positive space, and this woman here giving him a cute little kiss on the nose. Those would be considered the positive space. They're real physical things. And then the negative space in this image would be the open air around and in between them would be considered the negative space. So I could use that as my example for space as well. So now I have both of these pictures cut out to show you as an example of space, but remember you only need to choose one, but I wanted to do both just so I could show you what positive and negative space looked like, as well as depth of space with the foreground, middle ground, and background. So I can check that off of my list, and now I'm ready to find my very last picture, color. So color is going to be light rays reflecting off of objects. So for our color example, we want to find an image that has a good range, a whole spectrum of all of the colors. I don't want to pick an image, say for example like this, that just has one color or just a few colors. I want to find an example of something that has a lot of colors, a really, really nice big range. So I would say that this does, because we've got reds and yellows and greens and teals and blues and purples. We've got some orange. I think this would be a good example of color because it's got just about all of the basic colors in it. So I will cut this one out to use. Okay, so now I have my color example and I can check it off of my to-do list as well. So I've got a good visual representation of each one of the 7 elements of art. The next thing that we're going to do is come back to our sketchbook, and this is probably going to take the front page of a sketchbook page and the back page of a sketchbook page to get them all to where they fit on there together. But we are going to glue these down, arrange them, and then go through and label them together, and I want to show you how to do that. Okay, so I think that that's about all that I can get arranged on this page without messing up what I need to show in my image. So now that I've got those arranged, I'll put the other ones on another page, but I'll show you how I'm going to glue those down. We're just going to use some liquid Elmer's glue, and if you remember back in elementary school, you maybe had an art teacher that taught you how to say dot, dot, not a lot. That is a very good trick. So just do a couple of dots. Don't goop around and make big long puddles, but just a few little dots of glue is all that you need. And then get that aligned where you want it on your page. And then we'll do the same thing with the other ones. And then I'm going to flip it over to the back side and make space for my other images. Okay, so now that I've got all my pages glued down, I've gone through and labeled them, and I'm going to walk through and show you how to label yours. So for each element, you will want to label. This one is shape, texture, and form. But since this one was very specifically talking about shape, as in just the earring, I went ahead and drew and traced around that with my Sharpie, just so it would be really evident that I'm talking about shapes, as in circles and rectangles. For my texture, I not only labeled the texture, but I also went through my 3 different textures and labeled what they felt like. So the sweater was soft and fuzzy, the skirt was soft and silky, and the boots were glossy and smooth. So you want to make sure that you also label what those 3 distinct textures are in your texture image. On my next set of images, I of course down here have just labeled my cityscape with line. Very simple, very straightforward. For color, I just drew lots of arrows to indicate all of the different colors in this picture. And for value, I drew just arrows to indicate the ups and downs moving from dark to light. So for space, I wanted to show you how to label the 2 different types of space that we're going to be talking about in class. The first image, we talked about this as being 2-dimensional space. So I've labeled my dog and the woman as positive space. And then I've labeled the background as negative space. And just so I knew really what it was talking about, I just drew lines running through. That was a good way for me to visually represent the positive versus the negative empty space. If you chose a picture for space that shows depth of space, I want you to not only label the picture space, but also label the foreground and draw an arrow to what's in the foreground, the middle ground with an arrow, and the background with an arrow. And that gives me some more visual information than just labeling it space alone. So for space, you do have some extra things that you need to label, whether you choose positive and negative, or depth of space with foreground, middle ground, background. And the same thing for texture. With texture, you also need to label what types of textures, at least 3, that you see in your picture.